April 7, 1945, Okinawa. The morning air carried the acrid smell of burning sugar cane and cordite. In the hills overlooking the East China Sea, a group of 37 women huddled in a limestone cave, their hands trembling as American voices echoed closer through the ravines. They wore the torn remnants of civilian clothes. Some still clutched grenades with pins already loosened. For weeks, imperial propaganda broadcasts had filled their minds with images of barbarism. American soldiers who would violate, torture, and display their bodies as trophies of conquest. The youngest among them, a nursing student named Kimiko Yamaguchi, pressed her forehead against the cold cave wall and whispered a prayer to her ancestors. She believed these would be her final moments of dignity before a death she had been taught to choose over capture. Then the grenade she held was gently removed from her hand, not torn away, not struck from her grip, gently. An American Marine, his uniform caked with red Okinawan soil, spoke words she couldn't understand, but in a tone she never expected, soft, almost pleading. Behind him, another soldier held up his canteen, offering water. The cave entrance flooded with spring sunlight, and in that light stood men who looked exhausted, frightened themselves, and somehow reluctant to be holding weapons at all. Kimiko's indoctrination had prepared her for monsters. Instead, she encountered human beings. This dissonance between expectation and reality, between propaganda and truth, would reshape not only Kimiko's understanding of her enemy, but would reverberate through the testimonies of hundreds of Japanese women who survived the Pacific War's final campaigns. Their stories, long buried beneath the dominant narratives of male prisoners and combat soldiers, reveal a profound psychological earthquake that occurred in the prison camps of the American occupation. What these women experienced wasn't simply humane treatment by the standards of the Geneva Conventions. It was something they described in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews with a phrase that seemed almost blasphemous to speak aloud: paradise on earth. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, one must first comprehend the ideological architecture that shaped Japanese women's perception of Americans during the war years. The Imperial Japanese government had spent nearly a decade constructing an elaborate mythology of Western barbarism, a propaganda campaign so pervasive that it penetrated every layer of civilian consciousness. From 1937 onward, as the war in China expanded and tensions with Western powers escalated, Japanese media outlets broadcast increasingly lurid accounts of American and European atrocities. Newspapers published fabricated stories of Western soldiers in China desecrating temples, assaulting women, and committing acts of such depravity that modesty forbade their full description. Radio broadcasts featured testimonials, likely coerced or entirely invented, from Chinese women describing unspeakable treatment at the hands of Western military forces. For Japanese women, particularly those living in rural communities and smaller cities, these propaganda narratives weren't abstract political messaging. They were survival instructions. The Patriotic Women's Association, a massive civilian organization with millions of members, conducted regular training sessions teaching women how to commit suicide rather than face capture. They practiced with bamboo spears, learning where to thrust the weapon against their own bodies for a quick death. They memorized the proper way to detonate a grenade while holding it against their chest. School-age girls attended lectures featuring military officers who solemnly explained that American soldiers collected the ears and fingers of Japanese women as souvenirs, that capture meant rape, followed by public execution, that mercy was a Western concept that Americans reserved exclusively for their own kind. This indoctrination intensified as American forces drew closer to the Japanese home islands. By the spring of 1945, as the battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa unfolded, the propaganda reached fever pitch. Civilians on Okinawa were issued grenades and told that surrender meant fate worse than death. Women were instructed to kill their children first, then themselves, rather than allow capture. The evidence suggests this messaging was horrifyingly effective. During the Battle of Okinawa, thousands of civilians committed suicide in caves, jumped from cliffs, or detonated explosives rather than face American troops. Mothers drowned their infants in the sea. Families formed circles and detonated grenades together. The civilian death toll on Okinawa reached nearly 150,000, roughly one-third of the island's population, and a significant portion of those deaths were suicides driven by terror of capture. Against this backdrop of systematic psychological preparation for death, the actual experience of capture by American forces created a cognitive rupture so profound that many Japanese women initially believed they had died and entered some form of afterlife. The testimony of Shizuko Miura, a 23-year-old schoolteacher captured on Saipan in July 1944, illustrates this disconnect. In her post-war memoir, she described emerging from a cave with a group of students and civilian refugees, fully expecting to be shot immediately. Instead, American soldiers gave the children chocolate. They provided medical treatment for the wounded. They separated the men and women not for purposes of violation, but for processing and camp assignment. Miura wrote that she spent her first 3 days in captivity believing she was experiencing a hallucination induced by trauma or starvation, that the reality around her couldn't possibly be genuine because it contradicted everything she had been taught to expect. The American military's treatment of Japanese prisoners, including female civilians caught in combat zones, reflected a complex mixture of pragmatic military policy, cultural values, and institutional directives that distinguished American conduct from other combatant nations in the Pacific Theater. The United States had ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War, and while Japan had signed but never ratified the convention, American military leadership insisted on adherence to its principles. This wasn't simply humanitarian idealism. American planners recognized that humane treatment of prisoners served multiple strategic purposes. It encouraged surrender rather than suicidal resistance, it facilitated intelligence gathering, and it provided moral legitimacy to American war aims in a conflict increasingly framed as a struggle between democracy and fascism. For female Japanese prisoners, this policy translated into conditions that seemed incomprehensible within their frame of reference. The first shock came with the provision of food. Camp rations for prisoners under American custody included rice, vegetables, fish when available, and supplemental nutrition that often exceeded what Japanese civilians on the home islands were receiving by 1944. The quantity alone astonished prisoners. Masako Higa, captured on Okinawa as a 20-year-old member of the Himayuri Student Nurse Corps, recorded in her diary that her first meal in American custody included more rice than she had seen in a month under Japanese military rationing. She noted the presence of canned fruit, a luxury she associated with pre-war prosperity, and fresh bread made with white flour, something that had disappeared from civilian rations by 1943. But quantity was only part of the revelation. The manner of provision carried its own message. Food wasn't thrown at prisoners or distributed as a grudging necessity. American soldiers, often operating through translators or Japanese-American interpreters from the Military Intelligence Service, explained the meal schedules, asked about dietary restrictions, and made efforts to accommodate religious and cultural preferences. When prisoners observed Shinto or Buddhist fasting practices, camp administrators arranged alternative meal times. When women requested materials to prepare traditional dishes for holidays or memorial services, camp kitchens provided ingredients when supplies permitted. This attention to cultural dignity struck many prisoners as evidence of a profound philosophical difference between their captors and the military culture they had known. The symbolic power of American abundance manifested most dramatically in the institution of the mess hall. In Japanese military and civilian culture, communal eating followed strict hierarchies. Officers ate separately from enlisted men, men ate before women, adults before children, and portions reflected one's status and contribution to the war effort. American camp mess halls operated on radically different principles. Prisoners lined up regardless of their former status. Wealthy merchant wives stood beside rural farm workers, former nurses beside housewives, young students beside elderly women. Everyone received the same portions. The food was hot, served on metal trays that were washed and reused, not scraps distributed in salvage containers. Prisoners sat at tables, not on the ground. There was enough that second helpings were sometimes possible, a concept so alien to the Japanese wartime experience that many women initially refused, believing they were being tested or that accepting more would result in punishment later. One prisoner, interviewed decades later by the Japanese Ministry of Health and Welfare as part of a post-war documentation project, described watching an American soldier in a camp on Tinian scrape leftover food into a waste bin. The sheer volume of discarded food, rice, vegetables, bread crusts, stunned her. In Japan, every grain of rice carried symbolic and practical significance. Wasting food was considered a moral failing, an insult to the farmers who grew it, and the national effort to sustain the war. Yet here were American soldiers, themselves far from home and engaged in brutal combat, treating food with such casual abundance that they could afford to waste it. This woman said the image of that waste bin, filled with food that could have fed her family for days, communicated more about American industrial capacity and societal wealth than any propaganda or intelligence briefing ever could. She understood, watching that moment, that Japan had challenged a nation operating from a position of material abundance so vast that its soldiers could afford to be careless with resources that Japanese civilians would risk their lives to obtain. Medical care provided another axis of revelation. The Imperial Japanese military had a notorious reputation for neglecting its own soldiers' health, prioritizing operational objectives over medical treatment, and viewing wounded soldiers as burdens rather than assets deserving of care. Civilian medical infrastructure had collapsed under the strain of war, and by 1945, even basic medicines were scarce in Japanese-controlled territories. Women captured with untreated wounds, infections, or illnesses therefore expected no medical intervention from their captors. The assumption was that prisoners would be left to die, or that any medical attention would serve intelligence-gathering purposes rather than genuine therapeutic intent. Reality, once again, contradicted expectations. American military medical units treated Japanese prisoners alongside their own wounded, following the same triage protocols that prioritized severity of injury over nationality or combatant status. This wasn't universal. Some field units in the heat of combat made brutal calculations. But at established camps, particularly those housing civilian prisoners, medical care adhered to professional standards that shocked recipients. Nurses and doctors, many of whom harbored deep hatred for Japanese forces after Pearl Harbor and the brutal campaigns of the early war years, nevertheless provided professional treatment. They administered antibiotics, a class of drugs virtually unavailable in Japan by 1944. They performed surgeries to repair injuries that would have meant death or permanent disability without intervention. They treated tropical diseases, infections, and complications from malnutrition with protocols and medications that Japanese military hospitals couldn't access, even for their own personnel. Reiko Yamada, a 31-year-old woman captured on Okinawa with her 2 young daughters, later testified that an American Army doctor spent 2 hours reconstructing her daughter's shattered arm after a shell fragment injury. The doctor, working through an interpreter, explained each step of the procedure, showed her the x-rays, and checked on the child's recovery daily for 2 weeks. Yamada had watched Japanese military doctors amputate limbs for injuries less severe than her daughter's wound, had seen them perform procedures without anesthesia due to shortages, and had accepted these practices as the inevitable brutality of war. The American doctor's meticulous care, his evident concern for her daughter's long-term function and mobility, his use of precious medical supplies on an enemy child. These acts defied everything she understood about military priorities and human nature. She wrote in a letter preserved in the post-war repatriation records that this doctor restored my daughter's arm and broke my understanding of the world in the same motion. The provision of clothing and shelter followed similar patterns of unexpected dignity. Japanese military culture accepted deprivation as a virtue, a demonstration of warrior spirit and national sacrifice. Soldiers wore uniforms until they disintegrated, patched them with whatever materials were available, and considered complaints about physical discomfort as weakness. Civilians on the home islands by 1945 wore clothes until they were rags, reused every scrap of fabric, and accepted that comfort was a peacetime luxury. Female prisoners expected, if they survived initial capture, to wear whatever remnants they had been captured in, to sleep on bare ground, and to endure the elements without complaint. American camps provided prisoner uniforms, simple, functional clothing that was clean, intact, and distributed without regard to the prisoner's former status. These weren't elegant garments, but they were whole. They had buttons that functioned, fabric without holes, seams that were properly sewn. Prisoners received underwear, a detail so minor it seems barely worth mentioning, yet so significant to women who had worn the same undergarments for months or years, washing them when possible, and accepting their deterioration as inevitable. They received shoes or sandals, protecting their feet from the coral and volcanic rock that characterized so many Pacific islands. When clothes wore out, they could request replacements, and replacements were generally provided. Shelter standards similarly exceeded expectations. Prisoners lived in barracks or tent structures that provided protection from rain, wind, and sun. The buildings weren't comfortable by peacetime standards. They were crowded, hot in summer, and lacked privacy, but they were structurally sound. Roofs didn't leak. Floors were elevated off the ground, protecting inhabitants from mud and insects. Latrines were separate from living areas, dug according to sanitation protocols that prevented disease spread. Camps had washing facilities where prisoners could clean themselves and their clothes, maintaining basic hygiene in ways that had become impossible in the final months of fighting when Japanese civilians lived in caves, fled through jungles, or crowded into damaged buildings without infrastructure. These material provisions carried psychological weight beyond their practical function. They communicated that prisoners had value as human beings, that their physical well-being mattered to their captors, that American military culture considered basic dignity as a right, rather than a privilege to be earned. For women raised in a hierarchical society where one's value was determined by one's contribution and status, where the individual was subordinate to the collective, and where suffering was virtuous, this American insistence on baseline human dignity represented a philosophical challenge to everything they had been taught about social organization and human nature. The psychological impact intensified through daily interactions with American personnel. Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as savage, racist, driven by base instincts, and lacking the spiritual refinement that supposedly characterized Japanese civilization. The reality prisoners encountered was far more complex. American soldiers were themselves shaped by American culture, a culture that, for all its profound flaws and contradictions, included democratic ideals, religious traditions emphasizing individual dignity, and social norms that discouraged overt cruelty toward non-combatants. Many American soldiers were uncomfortable with their role as occupiers, homesick, and morally troubled by the war's brutality. They looked at Japanese prisoners and saw human beings, often women and children, who reminded them of family members at home. This isn't to romanticize American conduct or ignore documented instances of abuse, violence, and racism. The Pacific War brutalized everyone it touched, and American soldiers committed atrocities that stain the historical record. But at institutional levels and in many individual interactions, American treatment of Japanese prisoners reflected values that contradicted Japanese propaganda. American soldiers offered cigarettes to prisoners, shared photographs of their families, and sometimes engaged in rudimentary conversations despite language barriers. Military police officers enforced rules protecting prisoners from harassment. Camp commanders held soldiers accountable for mistreating prisoners, at least in official policy and sometimes in practice. Yuriko Nakamura, captured on Saipan and held in camps through the war's end, recorded in her post-war testimony an incident that crystallized this dynamic. A drunk American soldier entered the women's barracks late one night, clearly intending some form of assault. Before he could approach anyone, 2 other American soldiers appeared, physically removed him, and apologized through an interpreter the next morning. The camp commander held a formation, explaining that such behavior was unacceptable and would be punished. For Nakamura, this incident revealed more about American military culture than any propaganda could have communicated. The Japanese military, she knew, operated through unquestioned hierarchy and brutal discipline. Sexual violence by soldiers against conquered populations was so common as to be unremarkable, often tacitly approved by commanders as a reward for combat service. Yet here were American soldiers policing their own, protecting prisoners, and expressing genuine embarrassment about the incident. The message was clear. American military culture, whatever its other faults, included mechanisms of accountability and standards that applied even to the treatment of enemy prisoners. The presence of female American military personnel reinforced this impression. Many Japanese prisoners encountered American nurses, WAC personnel, and female Red Cross workers operating near or within the camps. These women, professional, uniformed, performing military roles, contradicted Japanese assumptions about American gender relations and women's status in Western society. Japanese propaganda had portrayed American women as simultaneously hypersexualized and degraded, lacking the moral purity and proper subordination that supposedly characterized Japanese womanhood. The reality was more nuanced. American women in uniform performed duties requiring education, technical skill, and authority. They gave orders to male subordinates. They operated medical equipment, drove vehicles, and managed logistics with professional competence. Japanese female prisoners observed these American women with fascination and confusion. How could a society function if women held such roles? How could men respect women who behaved with such independence? Yet the evidence before them suggested that American society not only functioned, but functioned with a prosperity and organizational capacity that Japan couldn't match. This cognitive dissonance forced difficult questions about the relationship between social structure and national power, about whether Japan's rigid gender hierarchy was a source of strength or a constraint on national potential. The camps became sites of involuntary education in American values and institutions. Prisoners learned English from guards and interpreters, picking up vocabulary and phrases through daily interaction. They observed American organizational methods, the bureaucratic systems that tracked prisoners, managed supplies, and coordinated between camps. They saw Americans solving problems through discussion and disagreement rather than unquestioned obedience to hierarchy. They witnessed elections in some camps where prisoners selected representatives to communicate with administrators about conditions and complaints. These democratic practices, limited as they were in a prison environment, introduced concepts of representation and participation that contradicted authoritarian models of governance. The symbolic power of these observations accumulated over time. Japanese prisoners began referring to certain objects and practices as evidence of America's different nature. The coffee that American soldiers drank became a symbol of casual abundance, millions of soldiers consuming a luxury beverage as a routine part of their daily ration. The cigarettes they offered, packaged in neat paper sleeves with printed designs, represented industrial sophistication and wealth that extended even to small comforts. The canned food that appeared in mess halls bore labels with cheerful illustrations and brand names, suggesting a civilian economy of such diversity and productivity that it could support thousands of companies producing thousands of products, even while prosecuting a global war. But perhaps the most powerful symbol of American values was paper. American camps generated extraordinary amounts of documentation, forms for prisoner processing, medical records, work assignments, meal schedules, mail logs, reports submitted to higher commands. This paper trail, tedious and bureaucratic as it was, represented a commitment to systems, procedures, and individual record-keeping that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic authoritarianism of Japanese military administration. Prisoners received documents confirming their identity, their camp assignment, their medical treatments. These papers seemed trivial, but they conveyed that the prisoner as an individual mattered, that their existence was recorded and tracked, that they weren't simply anonymous units to be disposed of when convenient. Sachiko Yoshida, a woman held at camps in the Mariana Islands, later described watching an American clerk spend 20 minutes correcting a misspelling on her prisoner identification card. The clerk, methodical and patient, consulted reference materials to determine the correct romanization of her name, then carefully produced a new card with the proper spelling. Yoshida found herself moved to tears by this small act of bureaucratic precision. No one in the Japanese military system would have cared about the correct spelling of a prisoner's name. Names were irrelevant. People were numbers, units, resources to be expended. But this American clerk treated her name as something that mattered, worthy of effort and accuracy. The message, subtle but profound, was that individual identity carried weight in American institutional culture. As months passed and prisoners adapted to camp life, more complex cultural exchanges occurred. Some camps organized educational programs where prisoners could learn skills, English language classes, vocational training, basic literacy courses for less educated prisoners. These programs served American strategic interests by preparing prisoners for post-war repatriation and occupation, but they also reflected a forward-looking assumption that former enemies could be reformed, educated, and reintegrated into peaceful society. This contrasted sharply with Japanese military ideology, which viewed enemies as permanent threats to be defeated or destroyed, incapable of reform or transformation. Religious freedom in the camps provided another revelation. American administrators, following principles of religious liberty embedded in American constitutional tradition, allowed prisoners to practice their faiths. Buddhist priests among the prisoners could conduct services. Shinto shrines could be erected in camp areas. Prisoners could observe religious holidays and death anniversaries with traditional rituals. This tolerance struck many Japanese women as evidence of American confidence and security. The Japanese state had increasingly insisted on Shinto orthodoxy and suppressed religious diversity as the war intensified, viewing alternative beliefs as potential threats to national unity. American willingness to permit diverse religious practices among prisoners suggested a society secure enough in its own identity that it didn't fear alternative beliefs. Mail service illustrated similar principles. Prisoners could send and receive mail, subject to censorship, but generally permitted. Letters to family members in Japan were collected, processed, and delivered when possible. Photographs could be enclosed. News from home, filtered through military censors, reached prisoners in camp. This maintenance of family connections, even during wartime and across battle lines, reflected an assumption that human bonds transcended political conflict, that a prisoner remained connected to family and community despite their status as an enemy. Japanese military culture had increasingly demanded absolute loyalty to the state at the expense of family connections, requiring soldiers and civilians to subordinate personal relationships to national service. American practice suggested different priorities. The end of the war in August 1945 brought new complexities to prisoner experience. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in his radio broadcast, prisoners in American camps faced psychological crisis. Everything they had been told about American intentions suggested that surrender meant Japan's annihilation, its people enslaved or destroyed, its culture erased. The emperor's decision to surrender, despite these supposed consequences, created profound confusion. Why would the emperor doom his people to such a fate? The only logical conclusion was that the fate wasn't as terrible as propaganda had claimed. American treatment of prisoners after Japan's surrender reinforced this conclusion. Rather than executing or enslaving prisoners, American forces began processing them for repatriation. Camps remained operational while logistics were organized, but the tone shifted from internment to transition. Prisoners received explanations of repatriation procedures, timelines for return to Japan, and assistance preparing for the journey home. Those who needed medical treatment received it before departure. Those whose homes had been destroyed in bombing campaigns received information about refugee assistance programs being established in Japan. The message was clear. Americans intended to return these prisoners to their homes, not to perpetuate their captivity or seek revenge for Japanese wartime conduct. The repatriation process itself became another learning experience. American transport ships carried prisoners home in conditions that, while not luxurious, maintained standards of basic dignity. Prisoners received food during the journey, medical care if needed, and protection from the elements. They arrived at Japanese ports not as broken victims of captivity, but as survivors whose physical condition, while often marked by malnutrition and stress, was better than that of many civilians who had endured the war in Japan's bombed cities and devastated countryside. Upon return to Japan, these women found themselves in a society struggling to comprehend its defeat and adapt to American occupation. Their testimonies about American treatment of prisoners created confusion and controversy. Some Japanese, particularly those who had lost family members to American bombing or combat, found these accounts of humane treatment difficult to accept. They seemed to contradict the sacrifices demanded by the war, to suggest that Japanese suffering had been unnecessary or manipulated by their own government. Others, particularly those involved in early post-war reform movements, seized on these testimonies as evidence that American occupation might not be the catastrophe propaganda had predicted. The phrase "paradise on earth," used by some repatriated female prisoners to describe their captivity, became controversial precisely because it seemed so extreme, so divorced from expectations. Yet the women who used this phrase weren't claiming that camps had been pleasant or that captivity had been enjoyable. They were describing a relative experience compared to the death they expected, to the propaganda they had believed, to the treatment they had received from their own military. American camps had seemed paradisiacal. This relative judgment revealed as much about Japanese wartime conditions as it did about American conduct. Post-war studies, including psychological research conducted by both Japanese and American scholars, examined the experiences of repatriated prisoners. These studies found consistent patterns in testimonies. Female prisoners reported lower rates of physical abuse than male prisoners, likely due to a combination of American cultural norms regarding violence toward women and the non-combatant status of most female prisoners. They reported adequate food and medical care in most cases. They described systematic efforts by American administrators to maintain order, hygiene, and basic welfare in camps. They noted instances of kindness from individual American soldiers that contradicted propaganda characterizations. These findings weren't universal. Some camps, particularly those established hastily during active combat or those run by commanders less committed to prisoner welfare, failed to maintain adequate standards. Instances of abuse, neglect, and violence occurred. The American record of prisoner treatment wasn't spotless, but the overall pattern, particularly in established camps housing civilian prisoners, reflected institutional commitment to humane treatment that distinguished American conduct from that of other combatant nations in the Pacific theater. The long-term psychological impact of this treatment on repatriated prisoners shaped post-war Japanese society in subtle but significant ways. Women who had experienced American captivity became sources of information about American culture, values, and practices during the occupation period. Their testimonies influenced civilian attitudes toward occupation forces, reducing fear and resistance in some communities. They participated in cultural exchange programs, served as translators and intermediaries, and helped other Japanese navigate the complexities of dealing with American administrators. Their experience had transformed them from prisoners into cultural bridges, however unwilling or conflicted that role might have been. Some repatriated women maintained correspondence with Americans they had met during captivity. Nurses who had treated them, interpreters who had helped them, administrators who had shown kindness. These connections persisted through letters and occasional visits. These personal relationships, formed in the strange intimacy of prison camps, humanized the former enemy on both sides. Americans learned about Japanese civilian experiences during the war. Japanese learned about American regional diversity, family structures, and peacetime aspirations. These micro-level connections, multiplied across thousands of individual cases, contributed to the broader reconciliation between former enemies that characterized the post-war period. The material abundance that prisoners had observed in camps continued to influence their perceptions during occupation. American relief supplies flooding into Japan after the war's end, food, medicine, clothing, construction materials, confirmed that the casual abundance prisoners had witnessed wasn't an artifact of military logistics, but reflected genuine American economic capacity. The speed with which American forces established functioning occupation infrastructure, rebuilt destroyed facilities, and organized relief distribution demonstrated organizational competence and resource depth that impressed even skeptical Japanese observers. Yet the prisoners' testimonies also revealed the limitations and contradictions of American values. American society in 1945 remained deeply racist with segregated military units, discriminatory policies, and widespread prejudice against Asian peoples. Japanese prisoners were sometimes subjected to racial slurs and discriminatory treatment that reflected this broader racism. American soldiers, for all their relative humanity in prison camps, had also firebombed Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, and had employed atomic weapons with devastating effect. The same nation that insisted on humane treatment of prisoners had prosecuted a bombing campaign of unprecedented destructiveness against civilian populations. These contradictions didn't escape the prisoners' notice. Their testimonies often grapple with the question of how a people who could be personally kind, who insisted on rules and procedures protecting prisoner dignity, could also wage war with such devastating efficiency. Some resolved this tension by distinguishing between individual Americans and American military policy. Others saw it as evidence of Western hypocrisy, a gap between stated values and actual conduct. Still others concluded that war itself created moral compromises that afflicted all participants, that the brutality of the Pacific War had corrupted everyone it touched, regardless of which side they fought for. The historical record of female Japanese prisoners' experiences under American custody reveals a complex interplay of policy, culture, and individual agency. At the institutional level, American military adherence to Geneva Convention principles, however imperfectly realized, created baseline standards that distinguished American conduct from Japanese military practice. At the cultural level, American values regarding individual dignity, religious freedom, and bureaucratic procedure shaped how camps operated and how prisoners were treated. At the individual level, American soldiers and administrators made daily choices about how to implement policies, enforce standards, and interact with prisoners. And many of those choices reflected decency that transcended military necessity. For Japanese women prisoners, these experiences challenged and ultimately shattered the ideological framework they had been taught. They had been raised to believe in Japanese spiritual superiority, in the inevitable defeat of materialistic Western societies, in the righteousness of Japan's imperial mission. They had been told that Americans were barbarians incapable of mercy or civilization, yet their lived experience contradicted these teachings at every point. Americans proved to be as human as themselves, capable of cruelty but also of kindness, organized to a degree that suggested cultural sophistication rather than barbarism, and operating from moral frameworks that insisted on baseline human dignity even toward enemies. The transformation wasn't instantaneous or complete. Many prisoners struggled with conflicting emotions: gratitude toward individual Americans who had treated them well, rage toward American forces for the destruction visited upon Japan, confusion about how to reconcile these contradictory feelings. Some prisoners maintained loyalty to Japanese imperial ideology despite their experiences, interpreting American conduct as a strategic deception or as evidence that Americans didn't fully understand the conflict they were engaged in. Others underwent profound ideological conversion, rejecting the nationalism they had been taught and embracing democratic and humanistic values they associated with American culture. What emerges from the accumulated testimonies, memoirs, and historical studies is a portrait of psychological transformation occurring at both individual and collective levels. Individual prisoners experienced personal revolutions in understanding, moments when their worldview collapsed and had to be rebuilt around new evidence. Collectively, these individual transformations contributed to broader Japanese society's adaptation to defeat and occupation, providing experiential evidence that American occupation might be survived, and even that engagement with American culture might offer opportunities rather than only threats. The symbolic power of food, that recurring element threading through prisoners' testimonies, deserves final reflection. In Japanese culture, food carried profound symbolic weight. It represented the harvest blessing, the farmer's labor, the family's prosperity, and the nation's strength. Wartime scarcity had made food sacred, each grain of rice a treasure. American abundance, demonstrated daily in camp mess halls, challenged Japanese assumptions about resource scarcity and national competition. If Americans could feed prisoners generous rations while simultaneously supplying millions of soldiers fighting across two oceans and maintaining civilian prosperity at home, what did that suggest about relative national strength? What did it suggest about different social and economic systems? The rice that appeared on camp meal trays, white and plentiful, became a silent messenger of American power. It communicated that the United States operated from such resource depth that it could afford to feed its enemies well. It suggested that American agricultural productivity, industrial organization, and logistical capacity functioned at scales Japan couldn't match. It demonstrated that American society had solved problems of production and distribution that Japanese society struggled with even before the war began. This rice, served daily, communicated strategic reality more effectively than any military briefing or intelligence report. In the decades after the war, as American and Japanese societies transformed and the former enemies became close allies, the testimonies of female Japanese prisoners gained new significance. They provided evidence of the possibility of reconciliation, proof that even after brutal conflict, former enemies could recognize each other's humanity. They illustrated how individual acts of decency, multiplied across thousands of interactions, could create foundations for larger political reconciliation. They showed that cultural understanding could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that prison camps could become sites of education and transformation rather than only suffering and violence. The legacy of these women's experiences extends beyond historical curiosity. Their testimonies challenge simplistic narratives about wartime conduct, revealing the complex moral terrain that soldiers and prisoners navigated. They provide evidence for the importance of international humanitarian law and the practical benefits of adhering to standards even toward enemy populations. They demonstrate that cultural differences, however profound, don't prevent recognition of shared humanity when circumstances allow for genuine interaction. They suggest that American soft power, the appeal of American values and institutions, operated effectively even in contexts where American hard power had created enemies. As the last survivors of that generation pass from living memory into history, their recorded testimonies preserve not just facts about prison camps and military policy, but something more essential: the psychological experience of having one's worldview shattered and reconstructed, of discovering that the enemy was human in unexpected ways, of learning that ideological certainties could dissolve when confronted with contradictory evidence. These are universal human experiences, not limited to one war or one nation. They speak to the fundamental human capacity for adaptation, for revising beliefs when reality demands it, for recognizing our common humanity even across the barriers of language, culture, and violent conflict. The women who once huddled in Okinawan caves, who held grenades with trembling hands, who expected death and found instead something they struggled to name, these women bore witness to a truth that transcends their particular historical moment. They testified that abundance can be a form of power more durable than weapons, that treating enemies with dignity can transform them from adversaries into witnesses for your values, that the daily practices of a society reveal its character more honestly than its propaganda. They learned, in circumstances none of them chose and few survived unchanged, that paradise is always relative, defined not by absolute standards, but by the gap between expectations and reality, between fear and experience, between what we're told about others and what we discover when we meet them as human beings rather than abstractions. Their voices, preserved in archives and memoirs, speak across the decades with a message that remains relevant. That even in history's darkest chapters, when nations mobilize for total war and dehumanize their enemies, individual human beings retain the capacity to recognize each other's humanity, to resist the propaganda that seeks to make such recognition impossible, and to build bridges across chasms of hatred and violence. The paradise they described wasn't a place, but a realization that survival was possible, that kindness existed even in war, that the world was larger and more complex than the narrow nationalism they had been taught. That realization, born in prison camps on Pacific islands, planted seeds of reconciliation that would flower in the decades to come, transforming enemies into allies and war into the foundation for lasting peace. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.